I'm Timoty Снайдер, and I'm delighted to have this chance to address the Security Forum about the centrality of Ukraine to the security of the continent and the world. I've been asked to say a word about history, and in particular the history of the Second World War, but I want to start by making the more basic point that this territory, the territory north of the Black Sea, has been quite critical to security arrangements, not just in the last century, but for quite literally a couple of thousand years. This territory has been critical to essentially all of the major civilizations that have emerged around Eurasia. So when we think about the centrality of Ukraine in 2025, of course it's natural that we look back to 1945, but the geographical position, the specific set of resources, and the dynamism of this region has meant that it was critical for much longer than that. What we're remembering is the Second World War, but what people often forget about the Second World War is the centrality of Ukraine to it. In Europe, the reason why there was a Second World War was precisely the contest over Ukraine. After the First World War, the territories of Ukraine, or most of them, had fallen to the Soviet Union. Ukraine was absolutely central to the version of modernization that Stalin sought to implement by way of the five-year plan and the collectivization of agriculture. Hitler and other German leaders witnessed this experiment. They were quite aware of the fertility of Ukrainian Black Earth, and their essential idea was that they could master the same territory that Stalin was trying to master. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, which is the major act of the Second World War, the chief war aim of the Germans was precisely the control of Ukraine. And this act, of course, this desire to control Ukraine and everything that followed from it, is also directly causal to essentially everything else we think about when we think about the Second World War. Not just the combat, not just the Eastern Front, but also the Holocaust, the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and all of the other major German war crimes. The Soviet Union won the Second World War. And of course, this is something that we're remembering today. The victory of the Soviet Union, the victory of its allies, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, all of the others. When we remember this, though, there's very often something else that we forget. Just as we forget that Ukraine was at the origins of the war, we tend to forget that Ukrainian soldiers were vastly disproportionately represented in the Red Army, which swept through Eastern Europe. We also tend to forget that civilians in Ukraine were far overrepresented in the civilian casualties, even on the scale of the Soviet Union. More Ukrainians were killed in the Second World War, civilians, than were Russians, not just relatively, but in absolute numbers. In Eastern Europe, the civilian victims of the Second World War are the Jews, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, in that order, followed by the Russians and the Poles. All this is important because we have to set ourselves the right framework for the memorial connection. As we remember this, there will be others who seek to understand the war and its anniversary in a different way. There are others in Russia, in the Kremlin, who would like to use the Second World War not as an occasion to remember what is wrong with fascism, but as an occasion to redo fascism. There are those who are treating the German invasion of 1941 as a reason why it was legitimate to invade Ukraine again in 2022 and before that in 2014. The present Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good reason for us to remember the evils of the Second World War. It's a good reason for us to remember the centrality of Ukraine. It's a good reason for us to remember the contest for resources. It's a good reason for us to remember the history of ideological lies, which covered that invasion as well as this one. But on the positive side, it's important to recognize that we now have an opportunity that one never had before. Given that Ukraine has been so central to the security of the region, not just now in the past century, but for much longer than that, we have to understand the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state and the ability of Ukrainians to defend themselves as the opportunity to put down another keystone of a European project. We now have before us a European project, which is threatened on all sides, but which is sustaining itself and which should have a bright future. But that bright future is connected very much to getting that Ukrainian keystone in place. So I believe the challenge before us, if we are thinking about Europe and the broader region, is for Europeans to do what is necessary to help Ukraine to secure itself. That can bring this long episode of a contest for Ukraine to a close. It's necessary, and we can see why it's necessary, but also, at the end of the day, it can lead to a Europe which is more secure. Thank you very much.